soccer, whatever term you prefer. I'd like to commence by saying a few words of personal introduction and background. As the program indicates, if you've seen that, I'm a professor of sport and cultural studies at the University of Central Lancashire in the northwest of England. And in connection with that position, I'm also director of a thing called the International Football Institute at the university. This might give the incorrect idea about my professional expertise. I am actually a humanities and social sciences academic. I'm not a football coach or a sport coach of any kind for that matter, and I have no formal training within the sports sciences, although I do work with people in my faculty with that type of expertise. In connection with my current post, I'm a research partner with the National Football Museum in England, which is located in Manchester. And much of my current work involves looking into the history and culture of football and how it is put on display to the general public. So I have an interest in sport museums, and I'm interested in those sort of developments in this country, by the way. My disciplinary background is in sociology, and my PhD was undertaken at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Some of you might have already picked up on an Australian accent. The topic that I studied for my doctoral thesis is, I believe and I hope, very relevant to today's general theme. And so I'm going to draw on it from my discussion and build that into the talk that I give here. The title of my thesis was A Feel for the Game, an ethnographic study of soccer, support and social identity in Western Sydney. Soccer or football in Australia has a very particular history, a history of development since the Second World War in connection with migration, with migrant groups from Southern and Central Europe in particular. Football for a number of communities, including those from Greece, Italy, Malta, and the now countries from the former Yugoslavia, placed football at the very centre of their communal social activities. And it's fair to say that apart from the church, that the football clubhouse provided the main gathering point for community members. The dedication of these migrant groups to football was in fact so strong that their teams soon came to dominate the professional football league in Australia, so that as recently as the late 1980s, the National League in that country was made up of teams with names such as Adelaide Juventus, South Melbourne Hellas, Preston Macedonia, and Melbourne and Sydney Croatia. There were no Serbian community-affiliated teams in the National League at that time. Clubs with names such as the Bonnyrigg White Eagles, and they were nearly always called the White Eagles, whichever town they came from, played in the State League and the regional leagues. Now, it was around this time that I commenced my doctoral candidature, and I did this in the spirit of an ethnographer. I wanted to go out in the field and get up close and do first-hand field research with people, actually go out, watch people and talk to them. And I did this by deciding to do a case study of supporters involved with one of the teams in the National League. I point out to you now that the choice I made of the actual supporters was quite random. The opportunity for that choice came through me as a teacher at the University of Western Sydney, where I taught the sociology of sport. A student in that class happened to be a 19-year-old Australian-born man of Croatian parents, and he was a supporter of the team Sydney, Croatia. And when he heard of my research, he made an invitation to me that I'll never forget. He said, "Come out and watch the boys in action." And I took up the invitation. The group in question happened to be a group known as the Bad Blue Boys, a name that will be familiar to a number of people here. Obviously then the term or the name was taken up and copied from the hardcore supporter group of Dinamo Zagreb. Compared to their Croatian cousins, this Australian group was very small, and it sort of reflected the proportion of the small crowds that you would get at Australian football at that time. However, the smallness and the informality of the group gave me a very good insight into the social lives of the young men and the meaning and the purpose of them being devoted to Sydney, Croatia, from their perspective. Although I had not originally intended to focus my research on hardcore football supporters, I'm actually very glad that I did, because the study that came from it, I believe, firstly made a very original contribution to Australian sociology, sociology of ethnicity, and how it intersected with questions of masculinity. Previous research in Australia had shown the difficulties of the migrant experience, but had tended to avoid looking at problematic elements within migrant communities, such as those involving and affecting young men. Now, of course, I did not intend for the study to be seen as representative of the Croatian community in Australia at large. The social behaviour of the young men says as much, if not more, about the failure of the broader Australian culture to accommodate them than it does about the Croatian community. I don't think it made any criticism of that community. Furthermore, I'd say that I would stress the randomness of the circumstance about the research. I may have well done my research into young Australian-born men from a Serbian background, and I may have found very similar behavioural traits of aggression and a propensity to violence, racism, sexism, and homophobia with those men, as I did find with the young Croatian Australian men. Indeed, had I done the study of young men from Italian backgrounds associated with football, I may have found the same sorts of things. And if we are to believe that there is a general crisis in masculinity, as some sociologists argue, some of the findings would be applicable to any group of young men in different locations. However, while we may speak of masculinity, it remains pertinent, indeed it remains necessary, to speak of masculinities, as Professor Connell reminded us many years ago, if we are to understand how and why men bond together along certain axes, including ethnic background. From my PhD study, I believe the hostility of the young Croatian Australian men had much to do with a sense of outsiderness and frustration they felt in Australia, especially at a time of crisis in their parent homeland. This became acted out in their capacity as football supporters, which seemed to merge with a surrogate form of militaristic identity, a type of identity relevant only in the context of their association with a homeland troubled by war. Their acceptance within their own community, the Croatian community in Australia that is, was quite mixed. Overall, from my observation, the parent culture seemed to take a kind of a boys will be boys attitude, and they turned a blind eye to the behaviour that went on at the football and in other places. Interestingly, less understanding came to them from their own age cohorts within the Australian Croatian community. And age cohorts who were university-educated young people. The small sample of such people I spoke to, both men and women, regarded the Bad Blue Boys as an embarrassment at best, at worst, a disgrace. And they believed them to be responsible for bringing shame to the Croatian community in Australia, especially when their behaviour at football matches ended up in the newspapers and in television reports. Spending much time as I now do in Belgrade, I get a sense of déjà vu when I hear young, educated people in this country denouncing the hardcore football supporters of clubs and the national team. And I wonder how much an awareness of that peer criticism actually serves to fuel the deviant behaviour rather than have a positive impact on it and making any impact towards countering it or slowing it down. An insight again comes from my Australian study. The young men of the Bad Blue Boys, and however bizarre this might sound to you, claimed that they were the true bearers of a Croatian tradition of manhood in Australia, basically that of a hard-working peasantry, which migrated under tough circumstances and literally built a new life, as could actually be seen from the very buildings around the Western Sydney suburb of Edensor Park, where the Croatians were mainly settled. The church, the King Tomislav Club next to the football ground, and the many fine residential houses that were built in a spirit of communal labour. The young men saw themselves as the heirs to this tradition, and it was no coincidence that many of them worked in the construction business with their fathers and uncles, and their professional aspiration was to own a building company of some kind. Generally, there was no aspiration to go to university, and those Croatian Australian men who did were regarded as something of a sellout by the young men of the Bad Blue Boys. I should say, though, I should be clear that this was not a view shared by the parent culture. To my observations, parents were very proud, supportive, and celebrated success at university of their children. This point on perceptions of tradition and the way that it is played out in the collective shaping of masculinities in nations, or in relation to nations with embattled historical identities, it seems to me, remains very important. I was very interested to hear a presentation recently in Zagreb by Boban Stojanovic on the shifting identity of Serbian masculinity within popular culture and how militaristic imagery is incorporated into this identity. Serbia's uneasy relationship with Europe seems to strengthen both the appeal to traditional nationalism and the view that the EU agenda for anti-homophobia is at odds with those traditions. So within this confusing mix, the gay parade somehow ends up being portrayed by those opposed to it as being at odds with Serbian culture and being imposed from those from the outside. Now, such a view would not be such a problem if it was held by only a small minority, and not to the extent that the parade is actually cancelled because of the active opposition that it faces. But that a few thousand young men can be effectively organised to protest violently against the parade on occasion when it is held is testimony to the pervasiveness of anti-homosexuality within a significant number of the young male population within this country. The extent of the link to football support is not entirely certain, but that there is an overlap would seem very likely, and certain related events that have occurred over the last few years appear to confirm this. The Australian answer to dealing with football supporter violence and related antisocial behaviour was to eventually abandon the National League as it was and start a new league to which clubs had to apply for admission. One of the key conditions for admission was that clubs making application to the new National League could not have any political affiliation. The subtext here was that clubs linked to ethnic communities and carrying such names as Sydney, Croatia, or variants of that name, would not be accepted. A de-ethnicising of the Australian Soccer League was effectively put into place, so that by the year 2005, the so-called ethnic clubs had been removed and replaced by new clubs, with rather meaningless corporate names like Melbourne Victory, the Melbourne Heart, the Newcastle Jets, the Sydney Football Club. This, in my view, was a very cynical move aimed to make the sport more marketable for a broader consumer and audience base in Australia. But in doing so, and I say this very critically as someone who was a passionate opponent of it, I believe it pulled the National League away from the ethnic communities that had nurtured it from the 1950s. And as far as the hooligan or hardcore supporter problem was concerned, it merely shifted it to other places, back into the state leagues and even into other sports. Australia, as some of you might know, has been one of the few places to experience crowd violence at tennis tournaments since the mid-2000s. And almost invariably, this has involved clashes between young men supporting Croatian and Serbian tennis players, respectively. So from this example, we see an individual sport doing what its administrators think is required to sort out the contextual problems facing the sport, but not in a way that addresses the underlying problem of those who are regarded as the problem. The reality is that sport bodies operate first and foremost from a point of self-interest in their own sport. And the best that can be hoped for is that good administrators see a genuine connection between business and social responsibility. In the case of Serbian football, the problem with crowd disorder is well known, and this came under the international spotlight in October 2010 when the problem was taken to Genoa during a Euro 2012 qualifying game between the national teams of Serbia and Italy. Given the presence of television cameras and newspaper photographers, behaviour inside the ground was highly visible. The throwing of ignited distress flares onto the playing field and the threat of Serbian hooligans invading the pitch, which led to the cancellation of the game and the game being awarded to Italy, received media coverage in many countries. The images will be familiar to all of us here, and they certainly caught the eye of the UEFA president, former French international football star Michel Platini. The UEFA president, if I didn't say that. Subsequently, Mr. Platini visited Belgrade in early 2011 to discuss the problem of Serbian football-related violence, both at home and abroad, with President Boris Tadic. Most alarming for Serbian football is the threat of the national team being expelled from international tournaments and of Serbian teams being excluded from qualification for the European Club Championships. The Football Association of Serbia was included in the discussion, and some of its senior members have joined a government-sponsored working party to come up with an adequate response. A resulting action plan, authorised by the Serbian government, focuses on the security and control measures within football stadiums by police and stewards on match day. How effective this response will be remains to be seen, but incidents at the Red Star Partizan derby last November at the Maracana, particularly involving again the throwing of distress flares, does not inspire much confidence. And it also indicates how the best of intended initiatives by the government and by the Football Association require the total cooperation of the football clubs. But even if these coercive measures do work to curb disorder within the football stadium and the surrounding area, how is this in any way dealing with the deeper issues of masculinity, of which such antisocial behaviour is merely symptomatic? Not much at all, I believe, is the answer. And this is not meant to be a criticism of the Football Association, which understandably has a primary obligation of responding to the immediate problem of dealing with the pressure from UEFA. And to their credit, the Football Association is attempting to work with football clubs in Serbia in a way to impact upon the football supporter culture by having clubs identify fans dedicated to overcoming problems of crowd disorder and to appoint these fans to leadership roles. This is a job easier said than done. Football supporters who genuinely desire a more socially positive future for Serbian football surely do exist, probably sitting in this room now. But given the difficulty of the circumstances surrounding football in this country, are they likely to come forward to take up practical leadership roles in challenging disorderly activities that seem to be rather well organised and perhaps carefully guarded by those who would not want change? Towards a conclusion, I think back to the young men of the Bad Blue Boys from Western Sydney. When writing up my thesis, I drew on the now classic sociological study, Learning to Labour by Paul Willis. In this study, Willis looked at how young men of late school age in Wolverhampton, England, enacted a tough working-class masculinity within school, and in a manner they believed to match the traditions of their working-class background. They didn't take school seriously, didn't take school work seriously, they mocked kids who did, they made sexist remarks to female teachers and female pupils, and their employment aspirations did not go much beyond working at a local factory. The subtitle of Willis's book, How Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs, was also his key observation, this being that the young men's attitudinal and behavioural response to their social circumstances became self-fulfilling. They ended up working in factories, and their social values did not adjust to those of the period, of the time. For me, the book's core theme was about the collective reproduction of masculinity. And for this reason, I saw a parallel with the young men of the Bad Blue Boys who used football as their identity playground to act out an imagined community based in a mythologized notion of Croatian manliness. Like the young men of Willis's study, they pretty much ended up with the jobs they aspired to, and in their case, married young women they referred to in the Australian context as good Croatian girls. Economically, it has to be said, they have done okay, a reflection of the prosperity of the country they have grown up in and their own capacity for hard work. The social values that they have passed on to their children, now that they're men in their 30s, late 30s even, I can only speculate about. The reproduction of masculinity in relation to Serbian football is, of course, another matter. But I think the term has relevance in a way that is obviously alarming when related to the extremist elements in football supporter culture. Now, not all young men who go to the football or who follow Red Star or Partizan are thugs, and to exaggerate in this manner, to suggest that it is so, is to be avoided. I recently watched the film Hughson, but I was not left convinced that the parents with sons gifted in mathematics should be especially worried about them drifting into the ranks of football hooligan gangs. Nevertheless, the problem of a violent and anti-social subculture developing in attachment to Serbian football is not to be dismissed. It is one thing to speak of an identity playground, and groups of young men will continue to use football supporting in different ways that, for better or for worse, fit this term, be this in Serbia or elsewhere. But it is another matter when the football becomes a breeding ground for a form of masculinity within which the ideological acceptance and practice of violence and associated social prejudices is embedded. As can be seen in my profile to the conference agenda you may have looked at, I am involved with a project titled Positive Futures for Serbian Sport. I'm sorry that not much of what I've said today about football is positive, but providing there is a commitment from within football, meaning clubs as well as the federation, to work not only towards the elimination of violence in the stadium, but towards the development of a more enlightened football culture, then there may be hope for positive change. And only time will tell on that. Hvala, to je to.